We have passed the 4 o'clock mark, so it's time to get this seminar going, although people are still entering the seminar through their Zoom link. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to this day's session of the Washington History Seminar, Historical Perspectives on International and National Affairs. This afternoon, we focus on a just published book by Tufts University's Elisabeth Leake entitled Afghan Crucible, the Soviet Invasion and the Making of Modern Afghanistan. I'm Eric Arneson from the George Washington University, co-chair of the Washington History Seminar. My colleague, Christian Osterman of the Wilson Center, is going to be moderating today's session. The Washington History Seminar, as you may know, is a collaborative and nonpartisan venture of the Woodrow Wilson Center's History and Public Policy Program and the American Historical Association's National History Center. And for over the past decade, the seminar has been meeting weekly during the academic year, in pre-COVID times, in person at the Wilson Center, and since the pandemic and post-pandemic era, well, here in the virtual realm. 2 people behind the scenes make these seminars possible: Pete Bierstecker of the Wilson Center and Rachel Wheatley of the American Historical Association. And on the logistics front, please note, today's session is being recorded and can soon be found on our institution's respective websites. And when we get to the question and answer section of the webinar, we ask those of you with questions to use the raise hand function, in which case Christian can call on you and you can pose the question yourself, or the Q&A function on Zoom, in which case Christian will read your question, and we will call on as many people as we can. And with that, I will turn the session over to Christian Osterman, who will introduce our featured speaker and our 2 discussants. Christian, welcome.
Thank you, Eric. It's a delight to welcome our 3 panelists, and I will introduce them as I give them the floor in the Zoom room. Our keynote speaker today is Dr. Elisabeth Leake. She is the Ellie Dirks Chair in Diplomatic History at the Fletcher School at Tufts University. She studied at Yale and the University of Cambridge and previously held posts at the University of Leeds and Royal Holloway, University of London. She's the author of The Defiant Border, the Afghan-Pakistan Borderlands in the Era of Decolonization, published by Cambridge University Press in 2016, and Afghan Crucible, the Soviet Invasion and the Making of Modern Afghanistan, as Eric mentioned, just published by Oxford University Press this year. Congratulations, Elisabeth. The floor is, the Zoom room is yours. Welcome to the Washington History Seminar.
Amazing. Well, thank you so much, both to Christian and Eric for the invitation, and thank you as well so much to Amna and Jaita for participating and for reading the book, and I hope it kept you awake or didn't at least put you to sleep. I'm going to go ahead and try to share my screen. I just have a couple of slides just to try to sort of illustrate a couple of points I wanted to make. So has that worked? Super.
Yes.
Fantastic. Brilliant. So I was asked to keep my my comments fairly short, so I'll do that. But I should say I'm more than happy to sort of answer any questions in the Q&A about some more of the specifics of the book. But I'm really delighted, I suppose, that my book, Afghan Crucible and the Soviet Invasion, the Making of Modern Afghanistan, was published this summer. It already feels quite a long time ago. But I kind of wanted to give just a very brief overview of the book and the project, and we can kind of go from there. So I've included, just to start off, a couple of maps. I always feel like it's very useful. And in this particular instance, too, I feel like it gives a fairly clear sense of the ways that the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan has sort of been understood and written about to date. And what I mean by that is that the fact that the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan has largely been understood and written about in the context of the global Cold War. And certainly then in that context of the Cold War, Afghanistan in the 1980s was one of the Cold War's killing fields and was, I suppose, part of a much longer history in terms of being a battlefield in the worldwide superpower competition between the United States on one hand, the Soviet Union on the other, and certainly then as a conflict that really devolved into widespread and life-shattering violence. So from this Cold War perspective then, the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan is certainly not atypical. So it sat alongside superpower interventions ranging across the world. So running from Guatemala and the Dominican Republic, for example, through to Hungary and Czechoslovakia, Iran, Lebanon, the Philippines, Indonesia, Korea, and of course, and as was made very clear, I think last year in a lot of sort of the comparative analyses, Vietnam and the Vietnam War. So much like these other kind of spaces of intervention, the Afghan Civil War demonstrated without a doubt how the Cold War shaped the so-called Third World, but certainly not only as an event that was co-opted by the superpowers. So this conflict certainly went on to influence the United States and the Soviet Union's own trajectories, as well as having lingering effects across Asia and the Middle East. But what I really argue in this book is that certainly while the superpower-led Cold War was pervasive, it was not the only story that was taking place. And I should say in this respect that the subtitle of the book might be a little misleading in that respect, but that was a marketing decision perhaps more than mine. What this project is and what Afghan Crucible really tries to do it's an attempt to write an international or global history of the Afghan Civil War of the 1980s. So in fact, the book does not start in December of 1979 with the Soviet invasion itself. Instead, it begins perhaps most obviously with the April 1978 coup that brought the People's Democratic Party of Afghanistan, the Afghan socialists, to power. But it also then roots events in the 1980s, and the roots events in the 1980s in Afghanistan's longer 20th century history. So from this perspective, then the Soviet invasion was certainly entangled with regional power competitions, for example, including the Sino-Soviet split, as well as Indo-Pakistani hostilities. But it also spurred on alternative visions of internationalism and global governance that rejected either US or Soviet domination, but often drew on a shared tactical playbook. And it was really then a war as well that forced Afghan actors into competition with international organizations, while Afghans' daily lives were under scrutiny by local Afghan and global forces alike. So in that regard, then the war was as much about territory, ethnicity, and community as it was about global alliances, political aspirations, and the nature of state power. So scholars have compared the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan with other Cold War crises to demonstrate the conflict's global and violent nature. In Afghan Crucible, I take a different approach, and I think this approach is, I guess, methodologically something I hope contributes to broader fields of international and global history as well. So effectively what I do in the book is that I examine a single conflict, the Afghan Civil War of the 1980s, through the multiple perspectives of many of the local, regional, and international actors who took part. So in other words, what I offer here is a multi-scalar and multi-locational approach. I've included on the slide, hence why I've got the pictures, the table of contents for the book. And what you can see, I hope, is that each chapter offers a different lens of analysis. So each chapter examines a particular group of historical actors, often based in a specific geographical location, and then delves into the ways that these groups approach the war. So as you can see, we move between Kabul, Moscow, Islamabad, Peshawar and the Panjshir Valley in Afghanistan, Washington, D.C., then the refugee camps along Pakistan's northwest frontier, most noticeably Nazarbag, which was one of the biggest refugee camps to emerge in the 1980s, and we end up in Geneva. So in turn, as you can see, we start out by examining the People's Democratic Party of Afghanistan, so the Afghan socialists, and look at the emergence of Afghan socialism. I then look at the Kremlin and the Soviet Politburo, as well as Soviet state builders on the ground in Afghanistan. I move on to looking at the role of regional state leaders headed by Pakistan, but also including Iran, India, and China. We then look at the Afghan resistance parties, and I should say most noticeably, I really focus here in particular on several of the Islamist resistance parties who frame their political aspirations in terms of both religion and politics, rather than looking at some of the more moderate or secular groups. I explore the actions and motivations of the Carter and Reagan administrations, as well as the key role played by the Central Intelligence Agency. I then move on to look at the experiences of Afghan refugees and their interactions with the UN High Commission for Refugees and the UNHCR's officials, who were widely placed across Pakistan and also in Iran to a smaller extent. And then I look at the roles of the UN General Assembly, as well as the UN officials who were tasked with ultimately negotiating a Soviet withdrawal. So really what I hope happens with this book is that this alternative form of comparison, on one hand, yes, I hope that it demonstrates the pervasiveness of the Cold War, but I also really seek them to sort of tease out and draw out the ways in which the conflict in Afghanistan also intersected with decolonization, the rise of international organizations, as well as looking at the alternative ideas and ideologies that drove local actors. So what I really hope is that by bringing together these different perspectives is that it allows us to peel back and to at least try to disentangle some of the layers of global, regional, and local engagement with Afghan politics and society, and consequently to hopefully reveal with far greater nuance the numerous, frequently competing, but also often interconnected motives that drove different actors who became involved in this war. So it's a war of not just local or national significance, but certainly one of regional and international significance as well. So across the book, just to kind of give some headline issues, I would say look at three different sort of issues or sort of key themes. So firstly, I look at some of the ideas that drove decision-making both within Afghanistan and abroad. So I trace 20th century histories of kind of competing Afghan modernity. So looking at the ways that different Afghan elites and intellectuals envisioned their country's future and kind of the future of citizen-state relationships within Afghanistan. So in particular, this includes looking at and tracing the ways that the PDPA adopted Marxism-Leninism, looking at how those ideas circulated and came to be embedded in Kabul, as well as exploring ways in which students and staff, particularly at Kabul University, also turned to political Islam, particularly drawing on links with Al-Azhar University in Cairo and the ideas and practices of the Muslim Brotherhood. But I also then look at some of the ideas that drove US and Soviet responses to the Soviet invasion. So for example, in terms of exploring the ways that the United States engaged with Afghanistan in the 1980s, I particularly explore the ways that American officials, both within the CIA, but also within the Carter and Reagan administrations, have encircled around the presidencies as well as the State Department. I look at the ways that American officials really adopted British colonial rhetoric that very much focused on Afghanistan and Afghans as being tribal and backwards. And those are two terms you see appearing in the documents time and again. And I really look at how this very circumscribed and very limited vision of Afghanistan ultimately limited the ways that the United States could and did engage with Afghan resistance groups as well as the conflict more broadly. And overall, I would say really ultimately to the detriment of US policy in a much longer term field. Secondly, then I look at the ways that some of these different ideas were put into practice. So with the Soviets and the Soviet Union, for example, I particularly explore how the Permanent Intergovernmental Commission on Economic Cooperation became a really key body of Soviet policy enactment, and how this group in particular was tasked with enacting the mandates of the Kremlin and effectively in translating professions of Soviet-Afghan friendship into different on-the-ground activities such as road and school building, the development of labs, the translation of pamphlets, and ultimately what they hoped was the creation of a functioning economy. On the other side of Afghanistan, I examine how General Zia-ul-Haq in Pakistan, how his focus on Islamization and Pakistani national security translated into support for Afghan resistance groups, and particularly Islamist groups such as Hizb Islami, because he sought to restrict the influences of Pashtun ethno-nationalism in both Pakistan and Afghanistan, as well as seeking to put sympathetic new Afghan rulers into power next door. So look at kind of how these different ideas are being put into practice by all of these different actors. Third and finally, then, I seek to explore the consequences, both intended, but actually much more frequently unintended, of decision-making that was taking place in Kabul, Islamabad, Geneva, or Peshawar. So we look at the regional alliances and political impetuses that ultimately brought Afghan Islamists to the fore over more moderate or secular resistance groups. And this is really linked to kind of regional forces as well as international forces, but particularly the role of elites in Pakistan and Iran, as well as the very canny sort of decision-making taken by the heads of these resistance groups, these Islamist resistance groups. I also then examined the forced migration of millions of Afghan civilians in response to Afghan socialist reforms, as well as the spreading civil war. I think one of the points I'm really keen to emphasize in this book is that the civil war of the 1980s created one of the biggest refugee crises that the modern world has ever known, and we're still living kind of with its consequences. And so in the context then of the 1980s, I particularly then look at these Afghan refugee camps, particularly those that emerged in Pakistan, as sites where alternative forms of Afghan society and politics emerged. So Afghan refugee camps, for example, were a site of convergence and conflict for a whole host of different ideas around rights, humanitarianism, and notions of social and political order. So on one hand, refugee camps reflected the longer history of the UN High Commission for Refugee and attempts to alleviate human suffering. They were these sites then rooted in older histories of Western humanitarian intervention, as well as attempts then by officials to impose order and organization on these forced migrants. But refugee camps also increasingly became sites where the government of Pakistan and various resistance groups also took advantage of changing social and political dynamics to try to create their own reshaping of Afghan society and politics, often in really unexpected ways. And one of the points that I make in the book is how one of the things that really, I suppose, differentiates this conflict in Afghanistan from earlier conflicts is the ways that the political party model in particular becomes a really key kind of mobilizational and organizational factor, not only in the ways that the civil war is played out, but also in the ways that Afghan civilians increasingly are forced to sort of engage with and wrestle with their experiences as being refugees and their interactions with different parties within the Afghan resistance. Finally, kind of along those lines too, in terms of thinking about intended and unintended consequences, I explore the ultimate disconnect between the United Nations-led decision-making in Geneva and matters on the ground. So the Geneva Accords are really a top-down negotiated affair involving the government of Afghanistan under the Afghan socialists, the government of Pakistan, the United States, and the Soviet Union. But these top-down accords did not stop fighting across Afghanistan. And political agreements that were made in Geneva that pledged to respect Afghan self-determination still nevertheless failed to create processes or spaces through which Afghan wishes could actually be ascertained. One of the really notable factors with the UN, kind of the UN-led negotiations, was the fact that the Afghan resistance parties kind of comprised, one side of the civil war, were largely excluded from the UN-led political negotiations because they were seen as non-state actors. So instead, these talks were conducted between the PDPA and the Pakistani government overall. And this really had significant consequences because what it meant was that these talks really were not particularly representative. And to add this as an observation, this offered the really, I would say, sort of uncomfortable parallel to developments in 2020 and early 2021 with some of the Doha-led peace talks. So this is just to kind of give a very rough idea of some of the big issues and kind of themes that I'm talking about in the book. And as I said, I'm more than happy to kind of talk about some of the specifics, but I didn't want to take up too much time. But just by way of concluding then, I think the thing, I guess we're all historians, a lot of us are historians here, so I don't think this will be surprising. But I think the thing I'm really most eager to show in this book in a lot of respects is that by taking this multi-scalar and multi-locational approach, I think what becomes most immediately obvious is that the Afghan crisis was so deeply messy. So the Afghan civil war attracted interests and actors from across the world. So it was really truly a global affair. So Soviet and American policymakers, officials from the UN and other international organizations, leaders from states such as Pakistan, Iran, India, and China, NGOs from across Europe and North America, and resistance fighters from across the Muslim world all converged in Afghanistan. And I argue that they did so because the conflict posed a litmus test, not just for Afghanistan, but also for the international order. So I think what happens in Afghanistan in the 1980s is kind of indicative of a much kind of broader series of crises that were rocking kind of international and regional politics. It's not just about Afghanistan and its sort of political future. Alongside this, I think one of the other really important takeaways then is, and what the point I really hope to make in this book is that it's so important not to think of Afghanistan as merely a site of regional and international intervention. I hope that this book, alongside a lot of really fantastic recent scholarship on Afghanistan, serves as a corrective to the idea of Afghanistan as just the so-called graveyard of empires. I think this is a really unproductive idea. What my book really shows is that, in fact, in the 1980s, educated Afghans, both within and outside the ruling elite, drove many of the conversations as well as the actions about Afghanistan's political future. And this was because they positioned themselves as global actors who were taking part in universalist debates about politics, the social contract, as well as international relations. And these Afghan elites, kind of various visions of modernity, many of which overlapped but also competed, these emerged in part from exchanges with external sources, but they also then looked to develop models that fit Afghanistan's local circumstances that nevertheless also then had the potential to be exported abroad. I think importantly, Afghan intellectuals and leaders at the time certainly did not see themselves as citizens of a so-called failed state. They did not see themselves as citizens of a state forced unwillingly or inappropriately into an international state system. Throughout the course of the war, they mobilized locally, but also in relationship with regional and international partners. And they did so to force new discussions about the nature of state politics, as well as about the future of Afghanistan. But equally, what also becomes clear is that the outlets for their activities were increasingly constrained by a host of factors. And this was not just in the era of kind of Cold War politics, but also due to the nature of governance at the United Nations, regional power competition, as well as Afghans' diverse lived experiences of the war itself. So I think what comes through with this book is that in many ways, the Afghanistan of the 1980s was a place of potential. So Afghan modernizers' ideas and aspirations, especially as they kind of crystallized in the course of the Civil War, these ideas and aspirations really mattered, and they reflected at a time and a place where it did seem possible that either side in the Civil War could succeed in fundamentally reshaping Afghanistan. Of course, as we know instead, the Civil War between the two sides did change Afghanistan, but not in ways that either group hoped for or anticipated. And of course, instead, the longer term legacy of the Civil War has been violence, both militarized and systemic. But exploring how different actors than inside and outside Afghanistan explored the so-called Saur Revolution, as the Afghan socialists called their 1978 coup, as well as the subsequent Soviet invasion, reveals then why none of these visions of Afghan modernity ultimately came to pass. The Afghan crisis of the 1980s really derived from politics and interests that were born in multiple locations and driven by multiple desires and aspirations. And really what ultimately came to pass demonstrated that collectively, these different ideas about what it meant to be modern, what it meant to be a state, and kind of how different forms of interaction between states and people should take place, these visions were ultimately irreconcilable. And as a consequence, I'd say we're still living with many of the consequences of the events in Afghanistan in the 1980s up through today. So I'll stop there.
Great. Thank you so much, Elisabeth. I'm now very pleased to introduce our first commentator, Dr. Jayita Sarkar, who's Associate Professor of Economic and Social History at the University of Glasgow. She was most recently a fellow at the University of Edinburgh's Institute for Advanced Studies in the Humanities. Jay's first book, Plowshares to Swords, India's Nuclear Program in the Global Cold War, was published by Cornell University Press in 2022. Dr. Sarkar is currently completing a second book, Atomic Capitalism, A Global History, under contract with Princeton University Press, and she's conducting research for her next book-length project, Partition Machine, From South Asia to the World. Full stop. She holds a PhD in history from the Graduate Institute Geneva and a research master's in sociology from the University of Paris for Sorbonne. Jay, welcome to the Washington History Seminar. Great to have you here, and Zoom room is all yours.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Christian. Thank you, Elisabeth, for this fabulous book on Afghanistan's tryst with modernity in the long 20th century. It really comes at a time when that country is embroiled in anew in a rapidly worsening social and economic crisis since the Taliban's political takeover a year ago. So your book, Afghan Crucible, which we all have a copy of, you can see the audience who haven't had the time to read it, could not have arrived at a wilder time for that country, as human rights and women's rights in particular are being systematically dismantled, and for the world at large as it chooses to look away at another site of foreign intervention, great power politics, and refugee crisis, namely Ukraine. It must have been challenging to write this book, Elisabeth, both in terms of limited access to primary sources about the interlocutors closer to the ground, as well as the emotional turmoil that you and most of us felt as the government of Afghanistan collapsed rapidly right in front of our eyes, because that was televised, creating an immediate human tragedy last August. So kudos for writing such an important book at a very difficult time. Congratulations, and thank you for writing it. And as it turns out, this is Afghanistan week in my course, Global South Asia in Glasgow. And we are in fact reading Professor Leake's article published earlier this year in Journal of Global History, Afghanistan and Decolonization of the UN. So it'll be another exciting discussion in my class. So without spending too much time in my comments, I'm going to keep my comments rather brief, and they'll be divided into three parts. So what I liked about the book, how it contributes to historiography. I'll make very few remarks, essentially to connect. You've already done a terrific job presenting the broad ideas. I'll do a little bit of mine. And then I'll conclude with one big question that's going to sound like three, because that's our profession, right? So let me begin by what I liked about the book. So the Afghan Crucible is very, very elegantly structured, with each chapter acting as a site from which Afghanistan was seen and its future reimagined and crafted. And viewing the Afghan civil war of the 1980s from sites such as Kabul, Islamabad, Moscow, Washington, Geneva, Peshawar, right, the hub of Afghan resistance activities against the PDPA, Nasserbagh, one of the dozen refugee camps northwest of Peshawar, powerfully disrupts the myth of Afghanistan as a site of foreign intervention, a so-called graveyard of empires, which Professor Leake passionately opposes in her account, which she also did in her presentation just now. Professor Leake poignantly shows how, and I quote, war turned Afghanistan into a country on the move. And thereby she foregrounds the human face of the catastrophe, thereby challenging the predominance of the prism of the Cold War, through which the Afghan Civil War has been studied, taught, and even remembered in contemporary historical accounts, both inside and outside the region. I think this overturning of traditional diplomatic history is really important, because as Professor Leake shows rightly in the book and also in the presentation today, that there is essentially a through thread that runs of British imperial gaze of the great game of the late 19th and early 20th centuries, to the Carter Doctrine of 1980, to the Reagan administration's policies of the 1980s, and to even the last 20 years of US involvement in Afghanistan. And it is a gaze that reduces the Afghan society as tribal, dismisses its actors as backward, and considers its fate predetermined as essentially chaotic, because what else could it possibly be? So I find Afghan Crucible a book not just on Afghanistan, as well as for Afghanistan. Because Professor Leake draws our attention to Afghanistan as a place of many possibilities. The 1980s is a decade of incredible potential in which elites, intellectuals, students, teachers, workers, party leaders, resistance workers, they nurtured multiple visions of social, economic, and political modernity and Afghanistan's place in the world. However unsuccessful those visions and dreams and hopes might have been in the end. I also like that Professor Leake craftfully interweaves her various interlocutors. And these interlocutors are at differential levels and distance from political power. And thereby she does, I think, justice to both US and Soviet policymakers who show up in the book, as well as PDPA workers, Kabul University student activists, Islamist resistance fighters. And needless to add that these actors are pitted against one another and often talking past each other. And so she shows the dexterity of, quite rightfully so, because it's her second book, dexterity of the historian's craft and the art of writing balanced histories of fraught pasts. So let me move to the second point about making some brief historiographical remarks. And what I really like about Afghan Crucible is that it encourages us to think of Afghanistan as a site of becoming, a battle turf of many possibilities created by decolonization as it became a sovereign nation state in 1919, and thereby serving as a model for anti-colonial activists in Asia and elsewhere in the ensuing decades. And in doing so, Leake challenges her readers to question the significance of years such as 1945, right? Traditionally understood as the end of the Second World War and the beginning of the Cold War, also eloquently challenged by Arnie Westad and Cold War A World History, as well as milestones like 1947, 1948, which are traditionally understood as moments of formal decolonization, like India, Pakistan, Sri Lanka, Burma. So formal decolonization in South Asia. And I find that together, Professor Leake's scholarship, Afghan Crucible, and her first book, The Defiant Border, really draws our attention to the long lives of imperialism, while expanding the scope of decolonization as an analytical framework to study the 20th century world. So she rightfully shows that the Soviet invasion and occupation of the country from the perspective of the Afghans was the recolonization of a decolonized state. So Afghanistan was both Cold War's killing fields, to quote Paul Chamberlain, but as well as sites of anti-colonial and anti-imperial resistance in the 1980s, right? So I find this a really important contribution in terms of forcing us how to rethink, study, and teach about the 20th century world. So I'm going to wrap up with one broad question, and this is broad in a way that's going to engage scholars like us, folks in the classroom, and so that's why it's intentionally very broad. So based on your work, Elisabeth, for Afghan Crucible and perhaps even Defiant Border, if you can share some thoughts on how can we study and teach international history with its emphasis on archival documents about groups who have been traditionally misrepresented as tribes, smugglers, terrorists, or thugs, right? What are some of the tools that scholars and students can use to render what is the imperial gaze that is often pervasive in Cold War archives as visible? Because I really like how you're forcing us to pursue these, not just, afterlives of decolonization, but really the long life of imperialism. So how did you go about giving voice to the traditionally voiceless? I see a lot of maneuvering methodologically that you've done in writing and research and writing of this book. So if there are some, pearls of wisdom that you can share with us that we can take to the classroom and in our own research. Thank you again for a terrific book.
Thank you, Jay. Elisabeth, would you like to respond? We like to keep these things a little interactive and conversational. So why don't we give you a chance to address some of the points Jay raised and respond to her question, and then we'll bring Amna into the conversation.
Yeah, of course. Jay, thank you so much. I feel like you described the book way more eloquently than I did. So, and you make it sound really amazing. So thank you for that. I appreciate it. But I love your question that you asked as well, because this is a question, I think, as you know, I think we've talked about it before, that I'm constantly wrestling with in terms of, how do we study and teach international history of these groups? And it's a point actually that I wrestled with a lot in not only researching this book, but then writing it and then thinking, I think, particularly about how I framed it. And I should say, so for the audience, I ended up actually including a separate note on sources that sort of explains some of the kind of the methodological questions that I brought to bear in this book. Because, I think firstly, one of the things I think it's really important to emphasize is first, is something I feel like historians are not as great as acknowledging as we should be, which is the fundamentally contingent nature of what we do, right? And how there are so many different factors that shape the histories that we write. And I think that's especially the case too, I think, in perhaps these histories when we're looking, trying to seek out voices that are more difficult to find for a whole host of access reasons. I think one of the things to really say about this book, and I very intentionally have framed it as an international or global history of the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. And I'm very, as much as I would love it to be otherwise, this is definitely not an on the ground subaltern social history of the Soviet invasion. So it doesn't offer, it doesn't offer a social history of the war, and it doesn't necessarily bring in as doesn't bring in perhaps as many Afghan voices as I would like. I'm more than happy to talk about that further, but it basically came down to a lot of the limitations I face researching this book in terms of time, money, language restrictions, etc. So I think that's an important thing, first of all, that I feel like historians perhaps need to take a lesson from social scientists in terms of being, I think, a bit more upfront about, what is it that we're able to do in terms of our research? What are we not able to do? And how does that shape the narratives that we're ultimately able to produce? But I think the thing that I really found here, and I think that was really important, and it's one of the reasons I think, ended up focusing the book around these questions of modernity, and thinking about these sort of Afghan elite intellectual visions, was the fact that I found there were so many Afghan voices in all of the international archives that I visited. And I think that was such an important point. And I think that was, and I think tracing those voices and tracing different groups, whether these resistance groups or different kind of individuals, through a whole host of international archives, not only sort of reaffirmed, I guess, the ways in which that a lot of Afghan elites and intellectuals in particular were very actively combating these imperial stereotypes that you've articulated so beautifully, but they very much saw themselves as international actors and acted as such. So I think being able to trace these groups through an international set of archives was a really important factor for me in being able to write this book, but trying to then find a balance between kind of embracing and engaging and interrogating that internationalism and these visions, but also recognizing what the book is not able to do has been really important. But as you say too, I think, one of the things that I think really came clear for me in this book is that, how inseparable histories of the Cold War and histories of empire really are. And I think the fact that, so frequently, obviously, Arna's work has been so fundamental, but also thinking about, I guess, how we teach histories of, it's like we teach histories of the Cold War, we teach histories of decolonization, and I'm equally guilty of that. But I think it's so important to think about how actually, and the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, and you say really, demonstrates us to a T that these are one and the same history. And I think that became so obvious to me, particularly looking at the American sources in particular. The fact that it's like this, the American ambassador to Afghanistan at the time of the 1978 coup, he likens Mohammed Daoud Khan, who's the leader of Afghanistan, who's killed in this coup in 1978, and Ambassador Elliott goes, Mohammed Daoud Khan, he's just like Sitting Bull. He's just like the Lakota chieftain in the United States. And that's the exact comparison he makes. And thinking about how these imperial notions about kind of so-called tribal populations, how those ideas circulate, and then have these unexpected and very, I think, really implicit consequences is so important, but it does take a really close reading of some of the sources to see how those ideas are so embedded, and they're not necessarily explicit, but they have these, really shocking consequences nonetheless. So I think I have so many thoughts on teaching and studying these groups. But I think, as you say, it's so important, I think, to think about the ways that these different actors, what language they're using for themselves, if possible. I think recognizing the global outlooks of these groups in particular was really important to me, and being able to share those documents, I think, has been really, really important. But also then alongside that too, I think I think it's very important to me to be honest about what this book is not able to do. And so I'm hoping somebody else will write that history.
Great. Thank you, Elisabeth. It's my great pleasure now to welcome Amna Qayyum into this conversation. She's a postdoctoral fellow in international security studies at Yale University, trained as a historian of gender and science. She specializes in decolonization, global governance, and the Cold War in South Asia and the Muslim world. Her current book project, titled Reproduction and the Global Biopolitics of Authoritarianism in Muslim South Asia, demonstrates how reproduction has crucially shaped postcolonial governance, development politics, and US foreign policy in South Asia. Her book manuscript is based on her prize-winning doctoral dissertation with research and writing support from the American Council of Learned Societies, the Society of historians of American foreign relations, the World Bank Group, as well as Harvard University, among other institutions. Along with her academic research and writing, Amna has also conducted policy analysis focused on gender and human security for the New America Foundation and the government of Pakistan's National Security Division. She holds a PhD from Princeton University, and it's just fantastic to be able to welcome her to the Washington History Seminar. Amna, Zoom room is all yours.
Thank you, Christian, for that introduction, and many thanks to the Washington History Seminar for getting us together to discuss Afghan Crucible. I'm excited to be in conversation with Dr. Leake and Dr. Sarkar and the participants in speaking about the many field-defining interventions this book makes. So let me get started in some of the key themes, along with some of the historiographical and methodological issues that this book brings up. And I believe, as Jay rightly pointed out, some of these are very pressing and timely concerns. So thank you, Jay, for framing those also wonderfully, and also framing how Afghanistan becomes a site of possibility in the 1980s. And when I was initially structuring my comments, I told myself I would stick to 3 points, but I found Afghan Crucible so generative that I hope you will indulge me as I raise a little bit more than I anticipated, but I'll stop in time. So the first thing that struck me, and Dr. Leake and Dr. Sarkar have mentioned this in their comments, is that the book itself is how beautifully it brings out the variety of perspectives that coalesced and conflicted for much of the late 1970s and throughout the 1980s. And so the book brings to the fore a multitude of Afghan voices, from socialists and Islamist leaders and activists to Afghans living in refugee camps. And it places their narrative in a global context alongside policymakers in DC, Beijing, Islamabad, but also humanitarian and internationalist actors operating from across a variety of different institutions. So the book's commitment in being attentive to place interest in actors, and as Elisabeth and Jay both pointed out, is reflected in its form, with each chapter taking up a different vantage point. And here I echo Jay in noting that the book really does present a model for scholars who are interested in writing international histories, but one that brings out these complexities of competing interests. And what I would also say is an ethical commitment to bringing narratives of great power rivalry in conversation with multiple actors on the ground. So Elisabeth, I know we've spoken about it before, but if you could also reflect more on some of the archival asymmetries and what role they played in the scope and form of the book, and at what points did access, but also the availability of certain types of records shape the narrative and the form of this book. And my second point then also stems from this broader historiographical intervention that you make in the book, which is to center local and regional geopolitics and histories of the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. And as both Jay and Elisabeth have pointed out, existing literature either conceptualizes it as a superpower rivalry in which Afghanistan is flattened and it becomes a mere site for Cold War intervention. But the book brings out the complexities of regional actors and politics, and not only how this drove, but actively shaped the invasion and its aftermath. And I'll point to 2 actors in particular. So in much of the literature, it's Soviet and US actors are at the forefront. But what I found particularly revealing was how active Chinese foreign policy was during this conflict. And Elisabeth, I'll just give a few numbers from the book. You mentioned that China provided about $400 million from 1980 to 85, but also support and training to resistance fighters, not only in Pakistan, but within China's borders themselves. So I was wondering if you could speak a little bit more about Chinese interests and role, and in particular, policy decisions made in Beijing, which seemed a bit counterintuitive to me. So, for example, rather than prioritizing support to Afghan Maoists, much of the support was directed towards the resistance that Pakistan was supporting. So what broader currents and interests of Chinese foreign policy was this moored in? And related to that, the book also brings out the pivotal role that Islamabad has played. And you rightly point out how Pakistan actively positioned itself as a natural broker for the conflict to serve 2 interrelated purposes. The first was to paper over some of the tensions in a strained US-Pakistan relationship at the point, with Ziaul Haq coming to power and still actively pursuing nuclear power. But it also was a way to establish Zia's regime's legitimacy, you point out, in the 1980s in Pakistan, the legacies of which are still very much present with us today. So if possible, it would be great to hear you speak a little bit more about how the Soviet invasion affected Pakistan's internal fabric itself. And a lot of the existing literature points toward Islamization and militarization, but you also very astutely point out some of the changes that happened with the influx of development and humanitarian aid to Pakistan. So while a lot of this was targeted towards Afghan refugees, Pakistani citizens, especially those in Balochistan and the Northwest Hunter province, also were affected by these development schemes. And my third broader point also stems from how Pakistan, along with other places, become global sites of Afghan resistance. And this book does a wonderful job in explicating how the Afghan resistance is not a monolith, rather there were competing interests and visions. And you show these differing visions, how they exist within Islamism itself, and whose rise, you point to it many times, is not preordained and is contingent. So it would be great to hear more about the resistance and how particular contingent decisions led to shaping the contours of this resistance. And in particular, I'm also thinking about hearing a little bit more about women and their forms of resistance. And you point towards the Revolutionary Association of Women in Afghanistan and how maybe their vision and modes of advocacy were different than the Islamist actors. And finally, I'll end with some points about the chapter on refugee camps, which I think is really generative and points towards future directions in scholarship. So you richly lay out how refugee camps, especially in Afghanistan, become a site for new forms of governance and models of subjectivity. So with identification and registration, privileging certain forms of identity, and also the socioeconomic development regimes that go along with it. And this also broadly reflects that you point out tensions within state sovereignty and global governance, with the government of Pakistan negotiating that certain aspects of the UNHCR mandate would be under Pakistani government oversight. So it would be great to hear you speak in particular about the gender dynamics in the refugee camps, which you do so beautifully in the book. And I think our audience, it would be great for our audience to hear a little bit more about that. And how competing visions of internationalist, Pakistani, and Afghan visions on women's and girls' education, labor, and mobility were conceptualized and written about. And I'm thinking both in terms of how they affected life at the camp, but also how these narratives would then circulate globally over time and inform particular visions of gendered humanitarian intervention in the region. Many of these conversations are still present with us today. And in asking you to, I think about some of these present legacies, I'll end here. So Afghan Crucible has been such a generative book to read, and I hope we can continue some of these conversations in the Q&A.
Thank you, Amna, for this rich set of questions to get our discussion going. Over to you, Elisabeth.
Brilliant. Amna, thank you so much. Those are all such, amazing questions. I'm going to try to keep it fair. I'm going to try to keep it brief, but someone cut me off if I get too excited. I'll pause on the question that is archival asymmetry, but I'm more than happy to come back to that because, like I said, I can talk about archives all day. But I think some of these other questions, like I'd love to touch on at least briefly. I think particularly, about the role of China and Pakistan, the Afghan resistance itself, as well as the gender dynamics. These are all factors that really come out. I have to say, so kind of as a word of kind of context, so I have this chapter that's basically rooted in Islamabad, but looks at the ways that regional actors, I frame them, I should say in this instance, as regional actors, how they engage with the conflict. So looking predominantly at the role of Pakistan, but also thinking about the ways that Pakistani elites interact, particularly not only with the United States, but also with China, Iran, and India, and in terms of kind of their policies and how these play out. I think, as you say, in some rather counterintuitive ways. I should say, like, as a point in case anybody asks, I mean, one thing I don't talk about in the book, which is a shortcoming, but like, which I'm hoping someone else will talk about, is like, I don't talk about the role of Riyadh and Saudi Arabia very extensively in this book. Decisions were made. I made decisions and they didn't make it, and Saudi Arabia did not make it in, which is not to say that Saudi Arabia is not important in this history, but I think there's been some really interesting work, especially in the kind of the so-called Afghan Arabs already. I didn't really want to replicate that. But I found China in particular, and the ways that Chinese elites engaged with Pakistan and thus engaged with the United States and the Afghan resistance, really fascinating. And I thought that was particularly one of those instances where you really can't separate out kind of the local, the regional, and the international politics, because what became clear to me was that they were so intermeshed. And kind of the Chinese officials' perspective on international politics really fundamentally shaped the ways that they engaged not only with Pakistan, but the Afghan resistance. So as Amna said, very interestingly, the Chinese government basically ignores the Afghan Maoists and doesn't offer them any support. So there were Afghan Maoist organizations that had developed in Afghanistan from the 1960s onwards. They also were active in fighting the PDPA and the Afghan socialists during the Civil War, but they were never very effective because they were marginalized by a whole host of different actors, including China. And I think the Chinese perspective on the resistance, I mean, can't be separated out, I guess, from other politics. So certainly, I mean, I think one of the things that's really interesting that it's actually Chinese officials who are the earliest, from what I found, Chinese officials were some of the earliest international observers to make comparisons between what the Soviets were doing in Afghanistan and what would happen and the American war in Vietnam. So this is before the formal Soviet invasion actually begins. But I guess that this fear of Soviet encirclement is certainly very alive and well in terms of Chinese policy circles at this time. And what's very interesting, and this is mostly kind of in official and public state-sanctioned rhetoric from China, is the fact that time and again, the Chinese officials are drawing not only direct correlations, but also direct linkages between events and developments in Southeast Asia and in Vietnam on one hand, with what's going on in Afghanistan on the other. And this notion that China is going to be encircled by Soviets and their allies on every side. And so I think what's really interesting, I think that's a really key factor that shapes Chinese decision-making. And then it's further sort of, I guess, given further meat by the fact that then kind of by allying with Pakistan not only very vocally supports China's position on what's going on in Southeast Asia at the UN. It's like one of the few states to really take China's side on that. And again, relates it to what's going on in Afghanistan. But I think there's also a pragmatic element to this too, in terms of thinking about kind of which groups are perhaps best positioned to, which Afghan groups are best positioned to combat the Afghan socialists and their Soviet allies. And I think it becomes very clear pretty early on that it is the Afghan resistance groups that have these safe havens in Pakistan and are receiving aid from Pakistan's inter-services intelligence, and then subsequently from the United States, that it makes more sense for kind of all of that aid to come together and kind of work through that region. Travel through Pakistan. But I think what's so important is you cannot sort of separate out the alliance between Pakistan and China in this instance with what's going on, I guess, in Southeast Asia at the UN General Assembly, as well as what's going on the ground in Afghanistan. Yeah, this question about the Soviet invasion and its impacts on Pakistan itself, it's such an interesting one. And I was so just kind of one thing to kind of draw on what you said. I mean, I think it's one of the things that's really interesting is that the UN High Commission for Refugees, in a lot of the reporting and debates about how to deal with this absolutely disastrous, horrific Afghan refugee crisis, they're also very actively discussing what the potential consequences of the refugee crisis will be for Pakistan. And I think that's a really important factor, I think, in terms of thinking about how this conflict shapes Pakistan itself. I mean, demographically, it hugely, right, it overwhelmingly reshapes the demographics of Pakistan's, what was the Northwest Frontier Province, now Khyber Pakhtunkhwa, as well as Baluchistan, but thinking as well about how it also creates, a big Pashtun diasporic population in Karachi and elsewhere. So I think kind of the demographic impacts are really, really important, but also then too how the government of Pakistan is able to basically manipulate international aid to basically reassert the role of the Pakistani state into less economically kind of fruitful provinces in the country. I think is a really important aspect. And it's sort of that development factor partners with Zia's focus on Islamization, which, as you said as well, has had this really lingering impact. But yeah, I think one of the things I do say in the book is that I suppose if there is a winner to this conflict, it is Pakistan in a lot of respects in terms of what I think the Pakistani state gets out of the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan and the Civil War in terms of influence, and realistically too in the ways that it gives Pakistani elites in the government so many tools at their disposal and so much money at their disposal as well to really kind of enforce a certain notion of governance that is, often very, as we know, it's often very exclusionary. On resistance and the gender dynamics, I mean, yeah, the resistance factors are, I think the Afghan resistance is so interesting. So just to say kind of one brief point that I make. So I think it's really important to recognize that the Afghan resistance, particularly as it kind of converges around Pakistan and kind of continues to cross across the border between Pakistan and Afghanistan, it's comprised of a whole sort of satellite of kind of different groups and interest groups that have a lot of different motivations and ideas of what Afghanistan should look like, or kind of what should be done to kind of eliminate the socialist threat within Afghanistan. Like I said, one of the things I think that really differentiates this conflict, I suppose, from earlier conflicts that emerged in Afghanistan around regime changes is the fact that the political party, as kind of a unit of organization and mobilization, becomes such an important factor in ways that are completely different from earlier conflicts. And I think one of the reasons for this is because of this longer history of the Islamist resistance organizations that come into being in the mid-1960s around Kabul University and are basically then forced into exile for resisting the Afghan state early in the 1970s. So they're already established. So they seek safe haven in Pakistan. They're already kind of pretty well established and pretty well mobilized in Peshawar at the point in time when the April 1978 socialist coup takes place. And effectively, what I would really argue is that because of these groups, because of their longer histories and the way that they've chosen to organize and mobilize, they really force other more modern and secular groups to follow suit in terms of the sorts of kind of structures that they adopt, as well as in the kind of ways that they try to engage with kind of local governments and the international community. But I think this is one of those factors and where kind of the regional issues particularly come to the fore. And I think it really is the roles of Pakistan. I think on one hand, the roles of Pakistan and Iran are so important in terms of kind of helping to kind of put the Islamist groups to the forefront of the resistance and basically making them sort of the international face of the resistance. That regional factor is so important. But these groups as well, they are so savvy. Their leaders are so savvy in terms of how they frame their messages and how they're sending people abroad to also sell their visions of what Afghanistan should look like across the world. And I look at they produce some really fascinating English language primary sources, their regular publications. So Hizb Islami has Mujahideen Monthly, their monthly English language publication that they use to sell their vision of kind of an Islamist Afghanistan. And that's just kind of one key source that I really like because I find it so thought-provoking. But I think kind of thinking about how they're very actively, local Afghan resistance groups are very actively framing this conflict not just as a crisis for the future of Afghanistan, but as a crisis for all small states across the world, because as Jay framed it, because of this threat of recolonization. So I think that's so important. Again, finally, then briefly on the gender dynamics in refugee camps. I thought, the gender dynamics in refugee camps is a really interesting factor, and I wanted to touch upon it at least briefly. And yeah, I think one of the things that becomes really clear through the book and clear through my research was, without question, I saw a lot of kind of Western educated humanitarian officials who came to the camps, who observed the refugees, who were part of the UNHCR's apparatus, talking very actively, as you said, about the role of women in Afghan society and kind of how that could perhaps be shaped or reshaped in a refugee camp setting. And I think so what I try to do in the book is to expose some of the different tensions that produces. So certainly on one hand, yeah, there's a real emphasis by a lot of UNHCR officials on this notion of self-reliance, on kind of ideas of kind of education and kind of educating particularly Afghan women, not only in terms of, I guess, kind of questions of literacy, but in the ways that they live their lives and things like personal hygiene, the ways that they cook food, the ways that they farm or raise poultry, et cetera. And a lot of those self-reliance schemes don't necessarily acknowledge what local dynamics were back in Afghanistan and are consequently quite problematic in that respect, and continue a lot of kind of longer lineages of Western imperial humanitarian practice. But also then there's also, like, I think very unsurprisingly, perhaps a lot of Western officials are highly critical of the fact that many women in the camps adopt or readopt purdah, or the practice of seclusion within the camps. And that stands in really stark contrast with some of the work of anthropologists at the time, who look into some of the very understandable and justifiable reasons why women actively chose not to engage with officials or chose seclusion for a whole host of different reasons, some of which were very actively tied to the trauma that they'd experienced in having to flee their homeland. So those are two history. There's that sort of tension between, I guess, kind of Afghan women's decisions to take that action themselves versus kind of, I guess, Western critiques of that. And then, of course, alongside that too, then there are these really fascinating Afghan feminist groups as well, who also are mobilizing in the camps and again lobbying to change Afghan kind of political and social dynamics in a lot of different ways. So the Revolutionary Association of Women of Afghanistan being one of the key ones that I talk about. But I think as well, one of the things that really shapes that group is the fact that, the Afghan resistance groups, and this is, a point that I try to make throughout the book is kind of how pervasive violence becomes across the conflict, and not just in a militarized sense. But what's so important is thinking about how some of the Afghan resistance groups are just as willing to use violence against Afghan refugees, and in this case, Afghan women, as they are against the Afghan socialists or the Soviets. And I think that really shapes the opportunities that those groups have. But I think also equally importantly, like RAWA, has continued to be very active for decades, which I think is so important as well. So yeah, sorry, that's a lot. But hopefully that sort of vaguely kind of answers some of those questions.
Great, thank you. There were a lot of questions thrown at you, so thank you. We'd like to open it up now to our audience. As Eric mentioned in the introduction, you can use the raise hand function to join the conversation directly, or post your comment or question in the Q&A functionality, and then I'll put it to our panelists. And Jay and Amna, feel free to, and Eric, of course, feel free to join the conversation at any point. Let me perhaps start off with a couple of questions. I have lots of them. Terrific book. Maybe I'll put some of them to you later, but just to, if you could talk for a moment to return to the archival question, just about the state of archives and archival repositories, other types of archives in Afghanistan itself, and to what extent they're accessible, what the state of play is, and the possibilities of accessing them as a international scholar. I'm very mindful of the risks inherent in doing research in Afghanistan. One of my assistants was killed in a terrorist attack in 2014 doing research for the Wilson Center. So this is mindful of that, asking this question. And my other question is, could you talk a little bit about, is there, and what are some of the debates or arguments in an Afghan historiography of the conflict? Maybe I'll start with those two questions first. Elisabeth?
Yeah, so I guess to answer the first so archives and the Afghan historiography. I mean, I did not get into, I suppose, the local debates about Afghan historiography in this book. As I said, I've really tried to position this book as a global or international history rather than, I guess basically thinking about this. I mean, to frame this book, I guess like one of my sort of questions was like, we have so many histories of the American war in Vietnam that everybody's familiar with, but we don't have anything like that for the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. And why is that? And kind of how can I contribute to those debates? So I don't feel like I've got a great answer to the question in terms of Afghan historiography. I mean, I think one of the things that's really exciting is that I feel like kind of histories of Afghanistan have changed so drastically in the last 5 to 10 years. I would really say, like, even when I started this project, there wasn't a ton of writing. There wasn't a ton of scholarship to engage with. But I think there's so many amazing scholars who have published really relevant research on this in the last couple of years. I mean, thinking about people like Meshkin Masumi and Wajma Osman. I mean, obviously Tim Noonan's book is fabulous as well. And the edited collections that Niall Green has put together. I think these are all really important works, but I think what's really interesting is that a lot of this work hasn't necessarily focused on the 1980s itself yet. So I would say maybe, I mean, at least from my perspective, and I could be completely wrong, is I don't feel like it's necessarily kind of an area that I think it still is an area that's really ripe for further development. And I think I know of some young Afghan scholars who are doing work on this now. And so I'm hoping, I think, there's so much to be written about this that I'm hoping that other people will do. In terms of the archives and the repositories, I think this links back to kind of the point I kind of made early on about kind of trying to be very honest about what I was not able to do. I did not go to Afghanistan for researching this book. I originally planned to go. And circumstances intervened for a whole host of reasons. But I think, one of the real issues that I wrestled with a lot, and I talked about this a lot too, is I guess kind of the moral aspect of this as well. I mean, this is a history, and, I know history books are important, obviously, but this is not a history that's important enough to put local interlocutors' lives at risk. And that was a choice I made that I didn't feel that it was right. And I'll be honest, like witnessing what happened in August last year with so many Afghans who worked with Western agencies of some form who were then abandoned, that reaffirmed that I think I made the right decision. But like I said, I feel like I was very fortunate in being able to find so many different Afghan voices across international archives. That being said as well, then, I mean, I think the Afghan digital collection and the Afghan library collections that have been digitized as a partnership between the Afghan Center at Kabul University and the University of Arizona is an absolutely priceless collection. And it's readily available, and I encourage everybody to use it because it's been underutilized. But it's an amazing source of material, not only on kind of 1980s Afghanistan, but kind of, 20th century Afghan history as well as 21st century. So there's so much material that's become available, especially in the last 10 years. Likewise, I was just speaking to some of the librarians at the Library of Congress, and they're completing a huge digitization project as well of their Afghan collections. So I think the important thing is that these materials are increasingly becoming available to write these histories of Afghanistan, and to kind of write histories of Afghanistan that can sit along, histories of India or histories of Pakistan or histories of South Asia, I guess that are on par and that are kind of equally fruitful. But I think those needs to be taken further.
Great, thank you. And just to be clear, I mean, you've done an incredible amount of archival research and other research for this book that's evident in the footnotes and your note on archives. Let me go to our audience. John Martin, you have your hand up, and I encourage others to do so as well. Join us. John Martin.
Thank you, Christian. This is a marvelous book. The scope of it is breathtaking. I wonder if you look at all the players in the Crucible over all the time you studied, what responsibility, what role would you give Leonid Brezhnev of the Soviet Union?
Yeah, thank you so much. Thank you for the question as well. I mean, I think Brezhnev definitely, I would say Brezhnev plays an important role within the context of the Politburo. I mean, I would say perhaps individually, I'm not convinced he individually plays the pivotal role. I think it's very much more kind of the decision-making that takes place around the Soviet decision to intervene is clearly kind of a result of conversations between a host of different people, all of whom are active in the Politburo. I should say, I think this speaks to, I think, a question that was in the Q&A section too about new sources that explain why the Soviets invaded. So, I mean, what's very clear to me, I think, from looking at the archives is I should say, firstly, no, I did not find, as much as I was hoping to, I did not find a lot new, exciting kind of declassified sources about Soviet decision-making, especially kind of high-level Soviet decision-making. I guess this leads back to the kind of the archive question as well. When I went to Moscow, I was certainly hoping for that, but I'd been told by a couple of colleagues that it was pretty unlikely. And when I got to Gatsby to the Contemporary History Archive, the archivists were just like, no, that's not going to happen. It's like there was like nothing else has been released. So I was really lucky though instead that actually I went to the State Archive of the Russian Federation and managed to access all of these files about these economic cooperation organizations that hadn't been used as much. And this is one of the reasons actually my chapter on the Soviets focuses, it certainly looks at and pays attention to some of the decision-making in the Politburo, but I focus actually much more extensively on Soviet state-building initiatives on the ground in Afghanistan, because those are where my sources took me. And I think the thing that was really, really fascinating for me based on those sources was just kind of the sheer scale of the Soviet invasion and the Soviet intervention in that respect. And I don't necessarily mean I certainly don't mean this purely in a military sense, but also just thinking about like the sheer number of Soviet ministries who became involved in sort of state building initiatives on the ground across Afghanistan. It's really fascinating and really mind-blowing just how extensive this was. But I think also what becomes clear though is that there is a whole series of disconnects then on the Soviet side. So not only is there's the military action on one hand, there's this really predominant, I would say, kind of even greater focus on state building on the other, and kind of trying to create a functioning socialist state within Afghanistan. But then there are obviously as well kind of very clear tensions that emerge within the Politburo and between kind of the Politburo on one hand, the international department on the other, as well as the KGB. And you really see a lot of the differences emerging in terms of the ways that kind of different Soviet officials talk about ways of kind of engaging with local dynamics and kind of what are the areas in which there might need to be compromise and what areas perhaps there shouldn't be compromise, as there shouldn't be as much compromise. But I think what became clear to me, and I think this part's not as new of a story, is that I think kind of the Politburo decision-making is clearly pretty far removed from what's actually going on the ground. And I think you certainly see that, I think, with sort of Brezhnev's sort of engagement and kind of, his willingness to sign off on a military invasion when it's pretty clear by that point in time from any other perspective that there's a full-fledged civil war taking place. So I hope that sort of answered the question.
Thank you. Let's follow up on the question by Michael Keyes in the Q&A. He's also asking, aside from his question about new sources on the Soviet side of things, why do you have a problem, he writes, with the tribal aspect of Afghan politics when tribal identity has always really been the key forum of identity for most Afghans and especially the Pashtuns?
Brilliant. Yeah, no, I appreciate that question. I think it's a really interesting one. I wouldn't say I have a problem with that identity, but I think there are two different points to be made. I think firstly, the ways that tribal identity is framed by colonial officials, whether the British colonial officials in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, or by American officials in the 20th and I would say 21st century, kind of the ways that Western officials think about and frame tribal identity, often it almost always has very kind of as civilizational kind of inferences to it. And I think, and kind of this idea that to be tribal is to be less civilized, and that has longer, or kind of a much longer lineage that has rooted imperial history. And I think that's a problem in terms of kind of this idea that it's not just about kind of tribal society or politics as kind of a socio-organizational unit, but it's got these kind of undertones of kind of backwardness, or this idea that if a society is tribal, then it's less able to be modern. And I think that analytical framework is really problematic, and it's not satisfying. It's problematic. It's often extremely racialized as well, or ethnicized, and it doesn't sort of leave scope for thinking about alternative forms of political and social organization. But I think the other thing that's really important, and this is the history I'm telling, is that to just think about Afghan society and politics through the lens of tribe is fundamentally self-limiting. I think one of the things that became very clear to me is, especially with the elites and intellectuals that I look at and who are very present in my book, is that tribal identity is only one form of identity with which they're engaging. And they are very actively thinking about different ways of defining what it means to be a citizen in a modern Afghanistan. And some of those definitions do take into account tribal identities, but a lot of them also don't, and also are very actively fighting against tribal and ethnic divisions within the country, and are thinking of ways of kind of creating a more united, or I suppose kind of more holistic vision of kind of Afghan identity and Afghan citizenship that are not reliant on tribal identities or tribal divisions. So I think one of the things I was looking at in this book is that, yes, certainly kind of these questions about ethnicity and tribe are important, but they've been overly dominant in narratives about Afghan history. And I do think that is problematic. And I think it's important actually instead to think about, well, what are some of the other ways in which Afghan leads and Afghans who've been in power in particular have tried to frame politics and society in different ways, and tried then to put those ideas into action.
Thank you. Eric, I think you said you have a question.
Yes, thanks, Christian. This is a fascinating discussion. And I'm going to pose a question that might be an unfair question, because when I give talks and whatever it is that I'm working on, I make it very clear that historians are very good at understanding the past, but when I'm asked about the present and the future, I am on more tenuous ground. At the end of your book, you write, it is difficult to know what Afghanistan's future holds. Yet you will try to offer an opportunity for a more critical and careful reflection on what lessons can be taken from the past, the history of Afghanistan, its region, and the international community to rupture the cycle of violence. So I would ask you then, as an historian, not a political scientist or an IR specialist, if you were advising policymakers today about, say, U.S. policy toward Afghanistan or the region, what are the lessons from the book that you would want them to know, that you would advise them about how to proceed going forward? So the history, the relevance of the history that you do toward policy today and tomorrow.
Yes, Eric, this is like the question I both love and hate, because I'm just like, right. I'm like, I'm a historian. I study the past for a reason. But I do, I think there's some elements in the and I very briefly alluded to this, but I think there's some factors in the 1980s that have resounded in our recent moment in very uncomfortable ways. And actually, a lot of these have had to do, I suppose, with the international community, perhaps more than anything, which I find really interesting. So I think one point that I think really stands out for me in my book on the 1980s, but like I said, I think you see this replicated in 2019, in 2020 and 2021 in really problematic ways, is this question of who gets a seat at the negotiating table when you were trying to end a crisis in a peaceful way. rather than in a way that's going to allow civil war to perpetuate itself. I mean, the real shortcoming of the UN-led negotiations in the 1980s that ultimately result in the Soviet withdrawal of troops is the fact that there was no representation whatsoever for the Afghan resistance parties, any Afghan resistance parties. So these were negotiations that, like I said, took place between the Afghan socialists, the government of Pakistan, the United States, and the Soviet Union. And so in talks like that are fundamentally unrepresentative because they're not bringing together all, the key interest groups, and really the Afghan resistance groups were so key in a lot of ways. It was like, well, those negotiations could never be successful in ending a civil war, nor could they really provide, a realistic kind of political solution to the crisis. And I was struck then, with something like the Doha peace talks, again, the talks, since the Taliban refused to negotiate directly with the government of Afghanistan, again, there were these imbalances in the negotiations and not everyone was brought to the table. So I think that's a real question I have, or something that I think is really important in this book, is that I think, looking at particularly the UN-led negotiations, and how those very tragically fail, it's because of this question of who gets to sit at the bargaining table, and the absolute necessity of kind of bringing together different interest groups to have these negotiations. So I think that's a really important one. I think a different sort of, I thought it's been interesting to look at some of the negotiations and discussions as well going on in the UN General Assembly around the Ukraine, and what's going on there versus what the negotiations were around and debates were around Afghanistan. So I think there's some really interesting, perhaps, lessons about the role of international organizations, and the still very important role that the United Nations plays, but also kind of, I guess, thinking about how changing international circumstances, I guess, make different members of the UNGA more or less sympathetic to what, to the motions that are being debated. But I think, in this case, in particular with Afghanistan, kind of the politics of imperialism and colonization and anti-colonialism were very, very important in uniting Afro-Asian and Latin American states in terms of decrying the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. I think you've got a bit of a contrast there with what's going on in the Ukraine. I think the final point is, I find it very difficult to talk about the Taliban for a whole host of reasons. But, I think one thing that we do have to think about is that we have to take their ideas seriously and to interrogate them and think about them critically in order to understand how they are potentially going to continue acting, not just within Afghanistan, but how they're going to try to seek political legitimation regionally and internationally. And I think that's one of the things I think that the book does try to do, is to take seriously the visions of these different Afghan interest groups, as well as the way they try to put them in how they've tried to implement them. And so in that sense, that is definitely not to say, I don't want to get into the question of kind of legitimizing the Taliban, but I do think it's important to understand, to try to really critically understand what their ideas are, in order to try to be able to create policy and to not just rely on stereotypes of the past. So I think basically an anti-colonial perspective needs to be taken as well in international relations. But I think trying to explain that to policymakers would be a little challenging.
Thank you.
Thank you, Elisabeth. You've talked a lot about groups and movements and the larger forces. Maybe as we get towards the end of the session, talk for a moment about perhaps the one or the two figures, individuals that really fascinated you as you were writing the book, as you were finishing your research. Bring the cast of characters there a little bit to life for us before we go.
Yeah, so some of the characters who really came to, or historical actors who really came to life. I guess the one who I guess I found particularly interesting is Ahmad Shah Massoud, who was an Afghan Islamist resistance leader, so affiliated with Jamiat Islami, one of kind of the most politically influential of the resistance organizations. And Massoud's really interesting because he had these alliances with the Pakistani-based resistance groups, but he was overwhelmingly active in the Panjshir Valley in Afghanistan.
but I found him so thought-provoking because of the way he fought the war in Afghanistan. And so he was, on one hand, he was a really brilliant military tactician and strategist. But on the other hand, I think he his more political activities provide a really interesting reflection on, I guess, what kind of a politically Islamic inspired government in Afghanistan that was, I guess, more collaborative could have been in Afghanistan. So in terms of these lost opportunities, I find his activities in the early 1980s really, really interesting in terms of the ways that he kind of allied with local populations and created tribunals. He created these, a whole host of infrastructures, kind of political infrastructures, educational, juridical, etc. And so I thought his political activities at that stage are really, really interesting. I mean, obviously, he's been critiqued for his activities in the 1990s in terms of the Civil War, and we can't forget that. But I did find kind of his vision of a kind of Islamist Afghanistan that was, I guess, certainly more accommodating than some of the other Afghan resistance groups. Really, really thought-provoking. And yeah, I think really thought-provoking. And I think, thinking about how his legacy as well has been really interesting. So I think he's probably one of the really key figures. I mean, for me, the other figures, I mean, like someone like Nur Muhammad Taraki, who's the first leader of kind of the socialist Afghanistan, who's the leader of the PDPA, who comes to power in April 1978, is equally fascinating in his own ways in terms of kind of how I think the ways he again also tries to envision a socialist, ultimately a communist Afghanistan, and kind of he's very self-aggrandizing in a lot of his rhetoric, but I mean the ideas that he puts forward are really fascinating, and he has this really interesting longer history of having interacted. I mean, he was trained in colonial India for part of his education. He worked for the U.S. government briefly, and then he suddenly, at least from an American perspective, he suddenly appears from nowhere, and they're like, where did he come from? It's like he was this new communist. So he's got this really fascinating longer history. But then the speed with which his regime basically self-implodes, I think, offers a very important lesson as well. And yeah, obviously he very much does not take Soviet advice about coalition building to heart, much to his own detriment. So I mean, they're definitely, I guess, two of the perhaps slightly more colorful figures who appear in the book. Yeah.
Great, thank you. Well, this is such a rich book. There's so many more aspects, dimensions that we could talk about. The role of Kabul University. I love how you start the whole story with this sort of microcosm, intellectual microcosm at the university, where most of the later characters probably interacted, at least probably past each other in the hallway, or questions about Islamic modernity and that you also raised. So lots of great topics you cover in this phenomenal book. Let me just say thank you to you for sharing some of these insights with us today, Elisabeth. Also, a big thank you to Jaita and Amna for their comments, thoughtful comments and questions that got our discussion going here. Of course, as always, to Eric for launching us, and I'll turn it now over back to Eric. Eric.
Thank you, Christian, and thank you, everyone. I get to draw this session to a close, but I do want to extend two invitations to those of you who are watching. First, please join us tomorrow, Tuesday, October 25th at 4 p.m., when we delve into Carolyn Elkin's Legacy of Violence, a history of the British Empire with discussants Dane Kennedy and Philippa Levine. And then join us again next Monday, October 31st at 4 p.m. for a session on Timothy Shank's just published book, Realigners, Partisan Hacks, Political Visionaries, and the Struggle to Rule American Democracy, with discussants Michael Lind and Elizabeth Tandy Shermer. We hope you can join us for both of those. Once again, thank you, everyone. Thank you, those who are in our audience. And until tomorrow and next Monday, take care, be safe, and good night.